What happens to the length of your sleeve if you're adjusting your bodice pattern using the bear hugger measurement I shared last week? I got a few questions about the length of the sleeve after adjusting it when you were working with the bear hugger measurement to determine where you needed ease. If you needed more ease in your cap, I recommended cutting it at cap level where you measured and spreading it. Now this caused a little bit of an overlap in the sleeve pattern, shortening the cap a little bit. So today what I want to do is I want to talk about the relationship between sleeve length and what that length is actually contributing to. And it brings another pattern into mind. My other favorite thing to talk about is pants fitting. So there's a commonality between pants fitting and measuring length, and also bodice fitting and measuring length. What do you think both pants and bodices have in common? I kind of want to do the clock. Do 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 do. All right, that's enough of that. Okay, so the length of your pants pattern is really divided into two sections, and the same thing is true for your sleeve. Now, it isn't exactly the same because a pants pattern, you're just dealing with the front and back leg and two different lengths, whereas with a bodice, you're dealing with two different measurements, but also three different pieces. So let me show you what I mean by this. So let's start with a pants pattern. I have this on top of my pattern pile here to share with you. What I want to point out to you first is I'm going to highlight, I'm just going to go ahead and draw a purple line right along my crotch here. What does this look like? Especially right here. Doesn't that look like a base of armhole, right? So let me get my bodice out here now. And so you can see, if we look at the curve of the armhole, okay, there it is. Both of these patterns create a curve to fit a part of the body in. Now, when we're working with pants, this is to fit your behind from crotch up and from crotch down. So this brown line, okay, that indicates everything above the brown line. That would be, waist to full hip. This length is related to the rise from crotch to waist. And then we have from crotch to hem, and that's really more about the length of the actual leg. So what I want to compare here is, I'm going to go ahead and say the length of the inseam is equal to the length of the underarm seam. Now I'm introducing the sleeve here without formally introducing it, but you can see here, this underarm seam and this inseam are both below the curve and indicate the length of the sleeve from the base of the armhole to the wrist. So this is length, base of armhole to wrist, and this is length of pant leg from below the crotch. All right, so those two things kind of agree with each other. And then if I go ahead and compare another measurement, and I'm going to use a different color here just to keep them separated, so let's use blue. If I measure or use the measurement from the side seam all the way up to the waist, okay, that's going to relate to the length of the sleeve from the wrist all the way to the top of the cap. So the center of the sleeve from wrist to cap, you can think of it kind of similarly to the side seam from the waist to the hem. Both of those measurements are interrupted or bifurcated by the crotch in the pants and the base of the armhole in the shirt construction. Then I want to do one more measurement. So we have side seam is equal to the center of the sleeve, all the way to the cap. The underarm seam is equal to the inseam. And then over here, if I measure from crotch level up to the waist, what is that going to be equal to? That's going to be equal to cap height from bicep to the top of the cap. Okay, so this is, we'll say this is 3, this is 3, and then this is 2, this is 2, and then over here we have, this is 1, and this is 1. So there's 3 different length measurements that you can consider, whether you're fitting pants or you're fitting a bodice with a sleeve. Now, the reason why I'm sharing this with you is because that prompts another question. Why is the lengthen shorten line on a sleeve pattern usually somewhere near the elbow, right? This is usually where you find the lengthen shorten line on a sleeve here. So the length of the sleeve, I'm going to take my arm off for a second here, from the base of the armhole down to here, that's what you're measuring when you measure the sleeve, which gets sewn to the armhole. The underarm seam extends from the base of the armhole down to the wrist. So that's why the lengthen shorten line for the sleeve is down here, right? Down at the near the elbow usually. Now cap height is very similar to the rise on pants because all of the length above the bicep line kind of gets stuck there, right? Just like if you have too much rise on your pants pattern, it doesn't fall past crotch. It kind of bags out and gets stuck and creates wrinkles because of the base of the crotch curve in pants. Well, the same thing happens when you're working with a sleeve. If you have extra length in the cap or not enough length in the cap, you're going to see that from the bicep up. Just like with pants, the length of the cap kind of gets stuck when the sleeve is then sewn into the armhole like this. So if I were to just sort of put this like this, so let's pretend we sewed it in there, right? So the base of the armhole down here, right, gets sewn here, and it rotates up to the top of where the shoulder seam is. And a lot of, some of the drafting books I work with will use the measurement from here to the shoulder seam to determine cap height. So that's another way you can get cap height when you're drafting. So I wanted to just explain that relationship because a question I got from last week's bear hugger circumference measurement tutorial was adding width to the cap shortens it, and then should you be trying to add that length back into the cap? Let's rewind to the beginning of determining cap height. I switched from measuring my body from my shoulder joint down to my bicep because I found figuring out where that bicep position is, it's a little ambiguous, right? It's kind of hard to translate from the outside of your arm through your arm to where the base of your armhole is to determine that bicep height. So it's a little ambiguous, right? Because you're measuring through your arm from wherever the base of the armhole is, and then you're measuring from that point on the outside of your arm up to the tip of your shoulder. And when I was doing it that way, I was getting an average of 6.5 inches. Okay. Then when I was thinking about it and I switched the way I take this measurement now, I use my actual fit muslin and I measure from the stitching line up on the shoulder down to the base of the armhole where the base of the armhole stitching is. So if I put this arm back on, okay, you can see that I have a pin here because I used a tape measure to wrap it around the outside of the arm to determine that. And what that ends up giving me, or what that ended up giving me, was a much larger measurement. My typical measurement when I measure from the tip of my shoulder down to the outside of my arm using this method of measuring is about 2 inches longer. Okay, so I'm getting around 8.5 for a cap height when I measure this way. Now, having worked with it both in person fitting classes for bodice and on Zoom classes for bodice, what I also realized was across a different shapes and sized women is that when you measure it this way, it kind of builds in a little extra ease. And this, I wish I had the scientific answer for why that happens, but I'm going to just go with measurements don't translate to the actual answer some of the time. And I think we're trying to capture, you know, the cap height by measuring the outside of the arm and comparing where the base of the stitching is, you know, at the base of the armhole and the stitching at the shoulder to do that. So knowing that you're going to get a little bit bigger of a number or a bigger measurement measuring the stitching line to stitching line versus just measuring your body, knowing that gives you the sort of the freedom to make some changes to your pattern that might reduce the cap after you adjust for that. And at the end, when you're, you know, if you have an ease problem at the end, you can make some adjustments to your sleeve with the bear hugger measurement to get everything to fit. So number one, I think it would be fun for you to try measuring both ways and see what you get. So I'm thinking like the holy grail of cap height measurements may be somewhere between both ways to measure. So just to review the order of adjusting a sleeve to fit into an armhole, first I adjusted the cap for cap height, so 8.5 inches. Then I walked the sleeve into the armhole to see how much ease I had, and I reduced the ease to be about 1 inch. Okay. And then I checked my bicep to make sure I had enough ease there. Then I sewed my shirt together, and that's when I had the aha moment to check that bear hugger measurement where you measure around your body, around the outside of your arms, you know, across your back and across your high bust, and then compare that to the pattern pieces. And if you missed that video, I'm going to put a link in the description below so you can check that out. So after doing that, I realized I only had 1/2 inch of ease. So I did add a little bit of ease to my upper back. And then I spread my pattern. This pink area is where I spread, and this green, light green area that I highlighted is my overlap. Because when you cut the pattern and spread, we don't want to change the length of the outside of the cap because we've already done, you know, we've already checked the ease, and it would be crazy to then go back and have to readjust the ease. So I'm going to show you again how to do that adjustment. But before I do, let's just measure what my final answer was here. So this is my bicep line, and if I measure it up to my cap, you're going to see I am short that 1/2 inch. So I lost 1/2 inch over here. I only have 8 inches now, but this sleeve fit me really nicely. I did in fact lose that 1/2 inch, but in the end it worked out fine. My sleeve fit great. The final answer for your cap height is probably going to be somewhere between measuring your physical body from the tip of your shoulder down to where your bicep is versus measuring from the stitching line on the shoulder down to the stitching line, you know, on the base of the armhole, and then finding that location on the outside of the arm. It's important to make sure your sleeve is also the right length, right? So instead of worrying about what the cap is doing, you can measure from, you know, your underarm seam down to your wrist to make sure that's long enough, and you can fine tune that after all the other adjustments are done. After you make these adjustments and you lose a little cap height, if you think you need more length from your bicep line down, you can go ahead and use this lengthen shorten line to lengthen or shorten the actual sleeve. But I just want to remind you how to do this if you need to add ease. So do that. I'm also going to show you how to take the measurement one more time. This is my Fit Index tape measure that's got a digital, you know, a digital reader on it, and I'm going to stick the little end into the base of the thing here, and then just to remind everybody, you want to make sure when you take your bear hugger measurement that you are straight across your high bust, around your arm, and then straight across your back. Okay, that's the bear hugger measurement that we're talking about. And you can see it's measuring the outside of your arm, and you want to kind of make note of how far down from the tip of the shoulder that is. Okay, and the reason why that's important is because you want to measure a similar amount down on your sleeve pattern. And just as a side note, I can't say enough about this little digital tape measure, so I am going to put a link to this in the description below if you don't have one of these. This makes measuring solo so much easier, because not only do you not have to see what's on, you don't have to see what's on the screen, because there's an app for your phone and you can store all your measurements in your phone. So I will put a link to this cool tool in the description below as well, because I am loving this thing. All right, so let's say we measured about 3 inches from the top of the sleeve. So I'm just going to go ahead and mark that, which would be right here. Okay, so this is where we're going to want to make that adjustment. So the first step is we are going to cut that off at that height, and then I'm going to cut up the middle and make a pivot. And let's say in doing our bear hugger measurement and comparing it to our pattern, we needed an inch more of ease, and the sleeve caps were the culprit because my high bust and my upper back were correct. That means I have to spread each cap a half an inch, because you've got 2. So if you need a total of an inch of additional ease, you get a half over here and you get a half over here. Now this is the important part that I want to make sure you understand. I'm going to go ahead and draw myself a line straight up the middle of this piece of paper here. And then, just to keep it real simple and easy, I'm going to go ahead and mark a 1/4 inch on either side of this line, like this. So when I go and tape my cap and spread that, I'll be able to spread it the half inch that I need, and it's going to be spread equally on both sides. This is important because we want to make sure we're adjusting, you know, the back and front a similar amount. All right, so I've got that done. Now when we go to add the rest of the sleeve back to the cap here, I'm going to trim my middle of my sleeve, and then I'm going to join them back together. But here is the important part. This is not like increasing the bicep, because we're cutting through, and I think you can see this here. If I just lay this like this for a second, you can see that we are cutting through the cap, meaning if I just put these little sew tight magnets here, all right, see, I'm spreading the cap on both sides. We don't want to do that because we've already adjusted for the ease on the cap. So that's where we're going to lose a little cap height, because instead of lining up the middle of the sleeve where we slashed in the middle, we're actually going to come up and line up the cap in the front and the cap in the back like this. So they're touching. And what this means is, I think you can see, we are not adding anything on either side of the cap. So we're lining up the pieces here, and what that's going to do is it's going to cause an overlap in the middle of the sleeve. So we've added our 1/2 inch that we needed right here, right? And we added nothing here and here because we touched them here and here. All right. Now, how much cap height did I lose in the area of the sleeve cap that gets sewn to the armhole? 0. So from here to here, there is no change, right? So this is the front of the sleeve. So the front of the sleeve has to sew all the way up to the tip of the shoulder, right? I didn't take off anything there. I just took off a little bit in the center of the arm, right? The outside of the shoulder. I took a little bit here, but I did not take anything off on the edges that get sewn to the armhole. So there is a relationship between how high the cap is and how wide the cap is. So if you make the cap wider and you're sacrificing a little bit of height, I think that that just works together. Now, of course, you have to test it, and there may need to be some fine-tuned fitting that needs to happen, but I've had really good success with this, and I just wanted to come back on and explain that yes, the sleeve does get shorter. The sleeve cap does get shorter, and I'm just going to draw this in here so you can see. Okay, so we lost this much right here. I'm going to color it blue. Okay, but again, notice we didn't lose any over by the stitching line, you know, going up to the cap. We really didn't lose any here and here. So I hope that helps you in your bodice fitting, and I do encourage you to compare those two body measurements of getting your sleeve cap from just measuring your body versus, you know, doing it this way. And then I think what I want to say is your final answer will probably be somewhere in the middle of those two measurements. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post those and I will help you. If you're enjoying my content, consider liking and subscribing to my channel because it helps me grow. And I want to thank everybody for taking the time to watch. Have a wonderful rest of your day.